spotlight me so nobody has to stare. Okay. So end of Jim Crow era into Great Migration. The other motivating factor that helped people to leave the South was that World War I happened, and so most of the young white men were being sent abroad to participate in World War I, and loads of them died. So in England, it was like 2/3 of the young men, like almost a whole generation of young men died, leaving, of course, since they had the quote unquote right, they had the right to most of the good jobs. When those young men went off to war, the factory jobs and lots of the middle class jobs were open. And so those jobs were filled by African Americans who were leaving the South and moving into the North and West of America, and Midwest also, and also by women. So this made a huge social change, right? Whereas before, we have what we think of as the Jazz Age or the Great Migration. I shouldn't go looking for a visual aid, even though I know there's a fabulous one in here somewhere. Before that time, like in the Victorian era, it was very, very much life was restricted by gender roles and class roles, right? So if you had men dancing, ooh, uh-oh, things are exploding here. If you had, uh-oh. Look, guys, we ran out of memory. Let's quit that. Come on. Let's not have a full-on computer crash in the middle of our lecture, shall we? Quit. All right. Let's quit that. Let's quit that. Okay, let's quit that. All right, maybe we can get through now. Oh boy, guys. All right. So by having the work strata upset by World War I, meaning that people who had been considered the underclass or forced to stay at home, so that's women and people who had been enslaved, coming in to do the same work that the privileged middle class white men had been supposedly the only people who could do the jobs. This changed the way that our whole society had to consider the value of the different people in its makeup. And that was sort of the first time it happened out of two in the 1900s, because of course it happened again in World War II when you get Rosie the Riveter images from women taking over the factory jobs. And in both cases also we have those amazing volunteer servicemen, the African-American men who fought in both of those wars. So that is sort of the beginning of this chunk of time we're starting to look at in jazz dance and Black vernacular dance in America. This is one of the images that I think is beautiful in this awesome Smithsonian article you got to read. It's James Earl Jones as a young man. So he participated in the Great Migration as a very small boy, and his family almost had to leave him in the South, and they did leave without his mother because his parents had separated. And the stress of first almost being abandoned and then leaving for a life without his mother made him develop a stutter. And so this amazing fact about him that I didn't realize, he stopped talking from trauma for about 8 years, I think it says here. And 4 years old when he left. And it wasn't until he had an amazing English teacher who encouraged him to read poetry in front of the class that he began to speak again. And then, of course, James Earl Jones became this amazing actor who played all of these roles that we totally love. But I just think it's a very illustrative story about how traumatic that change was and how brave the people who left the South and moved to the North were to escape not only the violence and the oppression and the legal structure of the South, but also to come out into the rest of America and realize, and this was sort of a realization for the whole nation at the time, that racism wasn't just happening in the South, that the rest of the country, although they thought that they didn't see themselves as bigoted, there was still segregation, there was still redlining of neighborhoods so that Black people couldn't get loans to buy houses and integrate into neighborhoods. There was integration in schools, but then also there wasn't. And really what happened in the Great Migration was that we changed the whole country's makeup, because by the end of it, 47% of the African-American population in America was spread outside of the South, whereas remember before that, 90% of the population was in the South. And so we changed the country, but it also made us realize that the structures that were inherent in our institutional practices and in our culture were still there. They just weren't as violently blatant. They weren't as violently blatant as they have been in the South at that time. So this is another article you had from this week, but I just thought this was an amazing illustrative picture. So this article is about the race issues and changes that happened in the 60s in Baltimore, which were the basis for this musical Hairspray. And so this is a real picture of a protest that was happening because of a segregated theater in Baltimore. So people are protesting that you can't go see a show in this theater with an interracial audience. And the crazy part now about this is the irony of this. Antony and Cleopatra is the show that they're playing. And of course, this is not Cleopatra, this is Nefertiti. And so like there's this blatant image of racial appropriation on the sign of the theater that's still upholding segregation in the North, and then this group of people protesting out front. I just think it's a brilliant photograph to illustrate how tone deaf the times were because of that thought where, you know, we're in the North, we're not racist. So that's sort of the setting for this week. And from there, let's look at some of, oh boy, guys. I guess I'm gonna have to come over here and quit that as well. Is there anything else I can quit right now? Leave that right. Where's my desktop? Leave that right there. Okay. Let's see if that gives us a little more computer brain juice. Maybe I should shut the windows that we have seen. Okay. All right. So, two big sections that we're going to get through today. One is to start looking at what happened in musical theater in America post vaudeville. So there was a question, this was my question when I was asking you guys if you had any questions. There was a question on the quiz last week about the myth of America. And please, I actually want to hear you guys answer this. Did you actually get the reading about how vaudeville created a myth of the American dream?
No, I actually had to search that one.
Sorry, that would be my bad. I think I scooched that reading forward to section E, and I didn't realize there was still a question in there. But it was a great reminder for me to hit on that. So let me clarify that. So there's an article you're going to read about vaudeville creating the myth of the American dream. So vaudeville, meaning, this is another thing I wanted to clarify. So before vaudeville, remember we talked about circus shows and these touring circuit shows that happened in America, right? So white minstrelsy and black minstrel circuits both happened in small theaters or outdoor places that would be set up just like a traveling circus. And then you would have a variety show. So one way you can talk about that is by saying the word variety show, early vaudeville, or minstrelsy are all words for that. And then when we go into vaudeville with a capital V, with a capital V, it usually means that we're in larger size theaters. And we're going to get back to that in the section coming up. So that's why it feels a little vague there. But the important thing for this conversation is to remember that vaudeville with a capital V on stages that were in cities big enough to hold a theater of that size had audiences which were interracial, because the cities and the urban centers from the 1900s onward, we had this second industrial revolution. So we have all these people who used to be working in agriculture are coming to the cities to change their life, and that creates a boiling pot situation or a melting pot situation. And so you have multiracial audiences which change the content of the shows, right? So you can't just be a showman who's performing to all white audiences who have never experienced living with other people from different cultures and then are making jokes at their expense, because now everybody's having to live together and you don't, make fun of your audience members. So that was definitely a change that capital V vaudeville started. And also capital V vaudeville changed from the saloon culture. So saloon culture, variety shows would play in circuses outside and in tents, and also in small theaters, and also in saloons. So you might be a performer who goes to like a big bar and does like a floor show there. Now we kind of call that cabaret, or like where burlesque and burlesque revival happens in saloons, more or less. Again, we'll get back to that, so I'm not going to go too far into that. But the big theaters could only exist where there's big audiences, right? For obvious reasons. And so as big theater transitions from vaudeville, which is a variety show setup, meaning that there are a bunch of little tiny acts, and there might even be small operettas, which could have opera singing or it could have more jazzy singing as things are changing, which would be like a play with musical numbers in it or dance numbers in it. But vaudeville and variety shows are a bunch of different acts, not one continuous storyline. And that is where you have a continuous storyline with songs and dance that hopefully, and this is sort of a next level that starts happening during the middle of the 19th century, that the songs and the dance move the plot forward. So they're not just like, let's pause for a dance. That is what we refer to as musical theater, in quotes, or capital M, capital T. It's not always capital M, capital T, but that stage happens in, let's see, it happens gradually, and we're going to talk about that transition again next week. So we're sort of jumping a little bit forward, and what is interesting in this segment and this category is looking at the ways in which musical theater, which had previously been telling this story, like the story in vaudeville is usually that strapping young lad comes to the city from his agricultural background, right? Because that's a story that most of the audience members could relate to. And through his own wit and good luck becomes, dun, 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 the glorious rich man in the suit who gets all the ladies. Yeah, so that's sort of your generic storyline that was extremely popular because that was what most people were hoping for. They were leaving these rural areas and coming to the city to try and build a new life. And most people came with nothing but their wits. So this idea is part of what we think of now as the American dream. And that's what that article that's missing, I'll put it back in, is really dives deep into, is when we think about what the American dream is, it is so tied up in financial success and the pull yourself up by the bootstraps idea that is now being questioned, I think, in 2020. And certainly in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of questions about the equity of this idea that you can come to America and make it big by pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And most of us know that that is malarkey, right? Like, that you don't just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and become a multimillionaire. You need luck, you need connections, you need networking, you need education, you need a family that supports you getting an education, you need a family that understands how to teach a young child how to study, and so on and so forth. And those things we are now realizing are white privilege a lot of the time, but of course those privileges aren't necessarily just white, but they tend to be in America. And also that the idea of success is about finances, and that it is not like in the American dream idea, there's also this sinister little subtext that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and by like wit and cunning. Because vaudeville stories aren't about like the guy who moves to the city and works his buns off and makes it big. And so those are interesting ideas that we'll leave behind for now, but I want you to let that thought sort of sink in. Like, how is it that our country's idea about what each individual deserves and what's possible individually, as opposed to what the society is responsible for creating together, it's some of those elements are still in that stereotype from vaudeville, like that rather than a whole community needs to lift a whole community out of poverty together, there's this weird like lone cowboy rides across the country and creates a whole railroad industry. Like, it's just so weird and imaginative, this myth of American success. And yet it infiltrates all of our beliefs collectively as Americans and as capitalists. So big things coming forward. Coming back to Broadway. After World War II, especially, right? So we had a second round of the young men going off to war, and the people who were not first pick for drafts, women and people of color, taking those jobs over, which when the young men came back, they had to face that they were replaceable. That's an awful way of putting it, but it's kind of true. Then we get this question on Broadway of how do we stop just thinking about the white upper classes, because in Victorian era, the only time you would see white men dancing would be in like a tux and tails. If you think about Vernon and Eileen Castle, or if you think about the upper class dances of the Victorian era, if you were in public and dancing, it was supposed to be elitist. And for dances like Irish jigs and for dances of people who weren't upper class colonialist class members, then there was a sort of like the act of dancing was considered more banal and more wild and uncivilized. So we had this stratification that starts to change finally in the 1950s, where instead of entertainment only, if you think about like 1920s musical numbers, right? Everybody's in tux and tails and the women's are all covered in sequins and giant flower or giant feathers. I know if you're missing that, it's coming. But in the 1950s, we start to see vernacular dances being put on stage because of this re-questioning of what does it really mean to be American, because it doesn't mean anymore to be an upper class white man. Of course, it never did. It's just now it's time to start representing that. So we have sort of, I want to make sure I'm covering my bases. We have changes of what goes on stage in terms of diversity, and we have changes of what goes on stage in terms of sexuality, and a change from the Victorian era that hid sexuality into letting sexuality come on stage and seeing female sexuality not just as the virgin whore dichotomy. So those changes start to happen in the 1920s, and especially after World War II. Why? Because we also have the birth control pill arriving after World War II. So we're going to get to that next too. But we still have a lot of whiteness. I'm just going to kind of put things on in the background while we talk, because you have all these links in your readings for this week. So this is Bye Bye Birdie, and you can see the dance moves are from social dances. They are evolved. This is set in the 1960s. These are evolved from Black social dances, but we have an all-white population doing them, and then it is choreographed for the camera, right? So if we were dancing in an actual restaurant or nightclub, people wouldn't be all facing the camera. But we have, dance offs and all of these elements that we've been seeing in other dances. And then we get to what we really talk about generically as musical theater dance or Broadway dance. And that is when we have the same stylized dances that we know and love from Black vernacular dance and vaudeville stages and into like the showgirl, kick line, all of that stuff coming. What we have that we call Broadway Jazz is a mix of social dances and classical training. So we started to talk about that just a little bit at the beginning of vaudeville when it came to the tap dancers who were performing on vaudeville in the 1920s who were mixing classical training. Those like Bojangles took that upright torso and blended it with the footwork in his tap dance style. And that was really huge on vaudeville stages. And even more so as you start to hire more and more dancers, especially in segregated performances, you're going to have dancers who come from a studio classical dance background, meaning ballet. That's so funny. I was just thinking in my head, like, oh, when we say classical dance, what we really mean is people who've been trained in ballet. Wah, 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 code. So one of the people that we mentioned before when we read about Africanist elements in dance was Balanchine. And Balanchine was a Russian man who escaped from Russia, came to America, and is an incredibly famous choreographer, most known for his works of ballet, but he also worked in jazz dance. And in the article we read by Dixon Gottschalk, she talks about how his ballet Apollo, I'm going to scooch forward a little bit, has elements of Black dance in it, right? And we didn't read the part about Apollo so much as we read her analysis of the Snake Hips Tucker. So this is a Balanchine jazz dance choreography. And now that we're in the 1950s, I need to pause and make a little vocabulary comment, which is that when we say the word ballet, it usually means what we think of in terms of classical dance. The positions of the arms, the upright torso that does not bend very much until you get to like the 1990s, late, very current ballet. And yet there's also the use of the term ballet, which means a longer stage performance that tells a story through dance. And I find that extremely confusing for folks who are new to dance analysis. So like this sometimes is called the ballet sequence in Slaughter on 10th Avenue, which was a musical that was turned into a film. But none of these people are dancing ballet dance. It's all jazz dance. And yet there is ballet training, which you can tell because of the way that they hold their torso still and the height of their kicks. So all these people have been trained in ballet dance, but they're doing jazz dance. And there are definitely times when ballet dance and jazz dance have overlapping elements. But some of the ways that you can really tell the difference between the two are ballet, the dance style, is never in parallel legs. It's just never. Ballet arms are almost always softly curved like a parentheses. They're never angled. Ballet torsos are almost always upright. And that's not always true, but it is very often true. So you notice that these dancers here are leaning way back off center into hinges, right? And there's lots of parallel legs. There's all these angular elbows. Those are all the elements of jazz dance, even though they are going to do single turns on one leg with one leg bent, a pirouette, but it'll be in parallel, not in turned out. So that is the big Western European meets social dance connection that starts us into Broadway jazz. We also, of course, continue with even more examples of tap dancing and all the acrobatics of tap dancing going together with classical dancing. So this is Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly dancing here, both great tappers and great choreographers. So here's Astaire and Kelly. Kelly is really an important person, not only because of his performances, but also because, it's so funny, they're like wearing fake beards. Also because he was like super, they were both sex symbols for their time, but Gene Kelly in particular was a super masculine sex symbol of his time. He was a Navy man, he was super buff, and he helped change the idea of dancing as something that othered people do to something that was very masculine and mainstream American. And he, don't get me wrong, Gene Kelly is full of grace, but because he did these extraordinary dance numbers as characters that were like soldiers and naval men, and he made it acceptable for men to dance as a masculine act if you were a white man. Of course, if you were a black man, it was always acceptable within Black culture for Black male bodies to be masculine and dancing. But for white America, we didn't see it so, we didn't see like ephebism and vibrancy and playfulness as acceptable for a white man, because white men were supposed to be upright and controlled. So you could have like a Vernon Castle in your tux and tails and be elegant and stiff while you were dancing, but to really let go and be wild and free is, again, that mix of cultures, and it changed the way that we looked at masculinity. So we're going to get back to that in our final category when we talk about gender and jazz dancing. Where this all ends up going, jazz dance for stage, is competitive dance and acrobatic circus dance. So in the background here, I'm just gonna leave the infamous cats going on here. Oh, my poor computer is dying, you guys. So I'm gonna jump forward. So Cats the musical, if you've never heard of it before, except for that it's something weird, that was the perfect moment, is famous because of what it did for dance performers in America. Cats the musical was the first musical where it wasn't singers and actors who could also dance. and you know, this is an exaggeration because of course there were always dancers on stage, but instead of focusing first and foremost on the acting and singing, Cats the Musical was about the choreography and about these highly technical, sometimes we call them tricks of jazz dance, being a huge part of the choreography. So there's musicals where you have movement, where people are mostly just walking in formations on the stage. Cats the Musical was the first musical where performers had to do triple second pirouettes and leaping toe touches in second. The choreography of this, the level of dance training was like, it was much more akin to like a straight dance show. So that's really what made Cats the Musical super famous. It's based on poems about cats. So you know I love it. There's yak fur costumes. It's crazy bananas, and the dancing is out of this world. So the other place that jazz dance led to, oh, let me pick just one of these. Let's pick this one because this one's the closest to. Is competitive dance. So you can see how this is a 1920s competitive dance number. So it's not set in the 1920s. This is obviously quite modern and current. This is a college competitive dance team. And you can see elements of Eastern dance here. You can see that there are, there's Eurocentric focus on synchronicity. There is a lot of legs, like a 1920s leg show. And then there is highly technical skills and tricks, right? So that's what I mean by highly technical skills and tricks that
focus on the sound
were what Cats the Musical brought to the Broadway stage that hadn't been there before.
Breathe out.
So this is called competitive jazz dance. I'm tempted to just stay here. I'm going to force myself to come away from it. It's here in your watch list, so you can come back to it. And that is where Broadway jazz dance ends up. So let's get back to the question of Americana. So in the 1950s, we have those dance elements, and then the cultural elements that we're bringing in from the historical side of things are this question and reframing of what does it mean to be American. So like, of course, we have the super famous West Side Story, which is choreographed by Jerome Robbins, who is also a famous ballet choreographer who worked frequently in jazz dance and also drew dance inspiration from the different cultures. So for Jerome Robbins, he was living in New York City. And so in West Side Story, of course, he's gathering elements from the immigrant populations in New York City, in particular, the Puerto Rican dances. Let's open this one up instead of the Jets versus Sharks. So this is also from West Side Story. We have Chita Rivera here, who worked with Jack Cole, who we'll get to next. And we have jazz dance. We have this made for theater choreography. We have the upright ballroom dance bodies, but then we have right. So none of those moves that those guys are doing right there would actually be happening in a Puerto Rican dance hall. Those are definitely jazz dance moves. But you have then also moves from Latin dance. There we go. So we have hip shimmies mixed with grapevines, mixed with stomping from African American dance. All of these things working together in a fusion as Jerome Robbins tries to re-explain what it means to be American, because it's all of these things together.
to San Juan.
I know a boat you can get.
Everyone there will give big cheers.
Everyone there will have moved here.
So one of the things that's happening here that's positive, right, is this integration of dance styles. One of the things that's happening here that is not there yet is the casting. Yeah, so we finally in the 1950s start to see integration of casts. And by cast, I mean not like class structures, but casting as in the actors who perform roles in the performance. So in this cast, you can see that there are people of different ethnic, racial backgrounds. However, they are not necessarily the correct ethnic and racial backgrounds. We still have a lot of casting that's sort of like, it's brown enough, because of course, you know, it's America and we still are working in theaters full of white people. But at least at this point, people are trying to make a change. So Chita Rivera is a Latin woman. Is she from Puerto Rico? I'm not sure, but you can see, especially in the gentlemen performers here, some of them are Puerto Rican, some of them are Black, which would be appropriate because there was mixed races in Puerto Rico before they came up to New York, of course. Excuse me. I have something in my throat. But there were also, and there still continues throughout the 20th century to be people who were sort of passing as different minorities. So that brings me to this question of blind casting and colorblind casting. I want to close on this discussion, but I want to just drop into this other page before we get there. I'm including this in our links for today. We're going to talk some more about Jack Cole. So this is an image from the stage show of West Side Story. Jack Cole was a closeted gay man choreographer who's incredibly famous. He's considered one of the main creators of jazz dance for theater. He choreographed this number, which of course you recognize. And Jack Cole, I'm saving him for next week because he also is part of the modern concert dance, jazz dance overlap section that we're going to talk about. And what was really big in modern dance, starting with the Denishon School, was taking not only from African-American dance, but also from Asian dance methods. So Jack Cole is known for choreographing a musical called Kismet, which is very Orientalist and takes a lot of pretty authentic, actually, Indian dance moves. So we'll look at that. And is this the one I wanted, or is it the next page over? It's the Met one. And so kind of coming back full circle again, when we look at some of these, where's this one, the bandwagon. So this is a musical number choreographed by Balanchine in the movie musical The Bandwagon. And the reason why I wanted to stop in here was to bring in another moment where Africanist elements are integrated into dance. And so what we're looking at here is a dance number that is, it looks cartoony, right? Like the set design is missing walls. Everybody's shapes are really frozen in these awkward, weird moments. And it's because it's 1953 and it's mid-century modernist stylization of jazz dancing. And so I'll include this link. This link was broken in your page today because these things just expire, but I think I found a good one. Oh yes, Sid Charisse. She's amazing. That's Sid Charisse and Fred Astaire dancing together. So what I wanted to do to just stop in here was to make reference to this article, African Influences in Modern Art. So this is another tie-in of arts influencing each other. The artists, Matisse, Pablo Picasso, that influenced the art of the mid-century, modern art as we know it, they were influenced by African statuary artists. And so it's fascinating to see how these statues influenced, oh, my page is scrolling funny, influenced artists like Matisse and Picasso. You can get some Picasso up in here, right? Modern art in the mid-century, the weird angles, the cartooniness, and then you look at how this sort of lost connection brings us back to jazz dance, or shows up again in jazz dance. So this modern art influence in the look of this jazz dance might be thought of as being influenced by Picasso and Matisse, the modern artists of Europe, but those modern artists were taking the angularity, the high contrast juxtaposition, and the ephebism from African statue art. So it's just a neat way to tie us all back again from a different cycle of influence. Alrighty, so closing with this question of blind casting, and I want to close my mouth as soon as I possibly can and give you a chance, because this is going to go into our next question. When we are casting now, we have lately been trying to either cast. So in the 1950s, we have all these problems with casting agencies and Broadway shows putting any old minority ethnicity actor into very specific roles. So if we talk about something like The King and I in South Pacific, there's all kinds of wrong ethnic casting going on in those shows. And even times where they would like cast a person who, an actor who was authentic into a role, but then overdub their voice because their voice was considered too much for the film or whatever. Ew. So in order to reframe and get over that bad behavior, what we have been doing now is there have been current experiments with blind casting, which is to say that you are casting an actor who may or may not be in either racial or gender terms matching up with the role that they're being cast in. And as we go into next week in this question of modern dance, we get to see people opening the doors to start casting, for example, ballets, but putting modern dance into them, or like breaking the expectations basically of the audience. And this is a very positive thing, but it does become a double-edged sword. So I want to sort of have you read this part of your reading and stick it into your mind. We're going to come back to it. And I know y'all are waiting for this, which is coming. So one of the most currently famous, obviously, because it's being introduced by the incredible President Obama, one of the most currently famous examples of blind casting is Hamilton right now, right? Let me scooch us forward to the dance scene. Hamilton took a story that was about a bunch of white people and he cast it with Americans of color. And this was mind-blowing for the whole country. it's something we needed to see. It changed equity issues on Broadway because Broadway casts, if you're always trying to cast an actor, singer, or dancer who matches the ethnicity of the role traditionally, then that really cuts out opportunities for performers of many different races and genders. And so by proving that this is real America and this is what real America wants to see on stage, Lin-Manuel Miranda, this guy here, changed the opportunities for performers on Broadway in a way that hadn't been done, in a strength level that hadn't been done before. So we're going to come back to Hamilton to talk about gender roles later on. But as we're looking at the choreography here, what is great to notice in the choreography is that even the choreography is this hybrid work, right? So we have, especially in the first act, if you've seen the whole thing, who's seen it? The first act is very hip hop heavy, and the second act has a lot more variety. But you can see in these movements that we started out with a lot of really acrobatic hip hop moves, and then we shift into the slow section, and you can see Black Lives Matter fists. You can see jazz lines happening. You can see an element, I think, of Busby Berkeley, who we'll talk about coming up, which is that most of the choreography formations in Hamilton are actually based on, instead of like a flat line facing the audience, it's more of, if you looked at it from overhead, it's like a circle or a wheel. So people, instead of walking left to right, left to right, left to right, according to the camera, are moving on basically spokes of a wheel or the circumference of a circle. So this action here, where we have dancers moving prop pieces, that's handy, but also artistic, is really an element of that we see in modern dance and contemporary modern dance. So let's, I'd love to hear, what are your takeaways? Can we unmute, my friends? Come back here, and I'd love to just have everybody give me like one or two words about what you think about this week's readings, the dances we saw today, anything at all. Let's start. I'm gonna start at the top. So can we start with you, Aika, and then Allison, then Crystal, Josiah, Josh, Jenya?
So I think that the biggest takeaway for me was that art like influences each other. So like one thing causes the other thing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, art influences each other and layers upon each other, which I think is really cool to see. Yeah. How about you, Allison? What's your takeaway? That's okay. Why don't you type something up, Allison? Oh, you're on the road. All right. To LA. I hope you see some. Oh, there's no shows going on. Damn it. Everybody get vaccinated so we can go to the theater again. Crystal, how about you? And then next I have Josiah. If you are ready, you can pop in.
Okay, I could go.
Yay.
What was the video that you had previously shown with the lady in the red dress?
Today?
Yeah.
Let me look. You can go ahead and talk and I'll see if I can find it. Red sparkly dress? Was it this one?
Yeah. I was, because you had posted Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal.
You called it.
Yeah, and I was like, oh my gosh, it looks exactly alike, especially the outfit too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, yes. Speaking to that point of art influencing art, it's absolutely the case that this piece was the inspiration for Smooth Criminal. Yeah, and Jackson loved Fred Astaire, and I think they did something together. I should look that up. I wonder if there's any documentation of it. But yes, this is the dance that inspired the Smooth Criminal video. Also, can I have those shoes? Yay! All right, who's next? Josh or Vincenna, whoever is quickest. What's your takeaway?
I think for me, it was the article that mentioned James Earl. I think. Oh yeah, the long-lasting legacy. I didn't have the title. The long-lasting legacy of the Great Migration. I thought it was kind of interesting how like it's the story of like just this huge band of like African Americans moving from south to north. But I think when reading it, it was kind of surprising to see that like, well, not really. Well, like it just unfortunate to hear that you had these like Black people with all this hope and stuff like that's like finally we can move away from all the terrible things happening south, but like the article mentions later on that like things started to shift even northwise, and that even in the north it wasn't all that different from the south. You had all these like racist policies and stuff like that, and it kind of like made it apparent that racism wasn't just like a south issue but like a national issue all around, which I don't know, I just thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, agreed. It's funny, right? Because we have oh, spoiler. She's got a gem. Yeah, we had all of these fabulous abolitionists working in the North pre-Civil War, but so few of those people had actually integrated towns. In general, in the North, we had very few people of color living there before the Great Migration. And it was really that change in World War I, where so many young men went off to war and died, that we started to see the more varietal populations spreading into urban centers more thoroughly throughout the country. And that, it didn't go as well as we'd hoped. And I think it's an important lesson to remember, because, history tends to repeat itself, and that's probably true right now. And I think we're in a moment where the nation is really trying to, some parts of the nation are really trying to question what we think of is acceptable, who we think has good behavior in terms of race and equity. And it seems, there's always more work to do, right? There's just always more work to do. And whenever we get a big change in economy, whenever we get a big change in migration, in work, it sort of reveals these assumptions that we've had as a culture about what is okay, right? And, this week it's about how we treat Asian Americans in this country. And there was a great discussion on NPR on Wednesday morning about the overlap between racism and sexism in terms of the mass shooting that happened this week. Like, some people were saying, oh, it wasn't, not me, but some people were saying, the mass shooting wasn't about those women being Asian American, it was about them being sex workers, and that those things are super intertwined, right? Like, one of the things that we talked about in terms of stereotypes of African American women in earlier discussions was this idea of the sexualized African American stereotype woman, where sexuality becomes something that's considered savage or wild, or having to do with a non-white privileged female, right? We have that dichotomy. So we're going to talk about that again as well. And I just think that whenever we have a big change in society, these issues come back up, and it's nicer to see them in art being examined than it is to see them being examined in brutality. But both happen. Does anybody else want to add anything before we head out today? Vincena. Dick Van Dyke and Mary Poppins. Yes, he did a lot of tap. Fun fact, he also did a very inaccurate but beloved British accent. Fun facts. We glanced for a moment at the dance scene from Bye Bye Birdie at the beginning, the 1960s dance in a burger shop, and Dick Van Dyke is in that as well, which is also a great musical to watch if you pop into there. All right, cool. Crystal's comment was, it's nice to see more diversity on stages at that time, even though it wasn't perfect and we still need improvement, but at least we got to see more women and men dancing in more different styles, such as masculine dance. That's true. And thank you for that great transition on out. We're going to look at a little bit more of Broadway jazz because we'll look at some of Jack Cole's pieces next week, but mostly we're going to talk about the incredibly fabulous Catherine Dunham next week. And we'll lean into modern and jazz crossover next week. And one of the things that's amazing about that will be really heartwarming after all of this darkness is that in modern dance and jazz dance crossover, we start to have not just appropriative bad casting, but like actual authentic representations of different dances. Catherine Dunham was a great researcher as well as an incredible dancer. So she actually she's from sort of northern Midwest America, but she went into the Caribbean and African dances, like studied them, learned them, brought them back and created both authentic representations of Caribbean dances on stage, but also fuse them with jazz dance for musicals and films. She's the choreographer of the big works in Stormy Weather. And she wrote books and like achieved her doctorate. So she's really the beginning of a broader vision of academic respect for different dance forms. And her work is just awesome. So we'll also see some Alvin Ailey next week. And we'll look at what happens when we actually have Black choreographers creating works in jazz and modern in American theater. Ta-da! Next week. It should be awesome. And then after next week, we'll have a try it out next week, which is going to be super fun. And then we have spring break. Yay, it's coming. And when we come back from spring break, then we'll spend a week together prepping for your midterm, which is some multiple choice and some short answers. But we'll spend all of the week after spring break working on that. So next week, modern dance, and then spring break. Yay, we made it. Happy Friday. Thanks, Aika. Anybody, any questions or any other needs before I head out?
No, thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Thank you, Crystal.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Have a great weekend, you guys. It's supposed to stop raining. Anything else? Josh, Vincena, anything?
I actually wanted to talk to you one-to-one